The earliest trace of the Fairmont affair still sits in a parish register, stored in Henrico County's damp archive room. At first glance, the entry looks ordinary. April 23, 1802, Thomas and Margaret Fairmont, birth of children, yet the ink betrays a hesitation. The rector's hand lists 2 christened infants, then leaves a space where a third name should be. On the opposite page, a separate note appears in a tighter, more deliberate hand. Mother recovering. Third child not to be entered. TF. That omission became the hinge on which the rest of the family's fate turned, though no one spoke of it aloud. The Fairmonts were a respected household in Henrico County, their plantation broad and immaculately kept. Travelers often remarked on the long drive shaded by chestnut trees, the wide porch that overlooked tobacco fields, the white clapboard house with its symmetry and polished brass fixtures. Nothing in that orderly facade suggested a secret already taking root inside the nursery. When Margaret went into labor that April morning, the house was filled with expectation rather than dread. She already had 2 older sons, healthy and well-bred. A new child would add to the portrait of stability she cultivated, with a quiet intensity that bordered on pride. But labor does not negotiate with social ambitions. Hours passed. The midwife, Esther, moved with calm precision, readying linens, boiling water, and directing the younger servants who hovered nearby. The first infant arrived easily, fair-skinned, quiet, unmistakably a Fairmont child. The second followed minutes later, another boy who resembled his father. For a brief moment the room eased with relief. Then Margaret's body seized again. Esther realized something was wrong before anyone else did. A twin birth had been expected. But what followed was no twin. The physician, summoned earlier but delayed by muddy roads, arrived just as the third infant was delivered after a brutal struggle that left Margaret pale as chalk. There was no mistaking his complexion. The room changed. It felt as if everyone inhaled and forgot to release the breath. Esther wrapped the child carefully. He was breathing strongly, dark-eyed and alert despite the harshness of the delivery. But Margaret refused to touch him. She turned her face to the wall, her expression rigid with disbelief. No one dared speak until Thomas Fairmont strode into the room. He took in the sight at once. 2 pale sons laid neatly in swaddling cloth, and 1 child whose presence rewrote every fact he believed about his household. What he said was never recorded, but several in the house remembered the sharp sound of something tipping over, and then his voice echoing down the hall. After that moment, decisions were made quickly. The 2 pale infants were carried to Margaret's side. The third child was taken from the room and brought to a small cabin near the edge of the quarters. The physician wrote nothing of the matter. The servants were told nothing directly, yet they understood everything. The child was given a quiet name among those who cared for him, Samuel. Life in the house after the birth. Outwardly, the plantation continued as usual. Overseers counted tobacco bundles. Visitors arrived for supper. Ledgers were tallied. But anyone living inside the house felt the change immediately. Margaret withdrew from nearly all activity. Curtains stayed drawn. She refused company, even from her closest acquaintances in the county. Her conversation became brief and brittle, and her gaze seemed fixed on a point just beyond the room she occupied. Thomas shifted between long silences and abrupt outbursts. He spent more time in his study, the door locked, decanters emptying faster than usual. He rarely spoke to Margaret beyond what duty required. When asked by neighbors about the newborns, he replied with a curt assurance that both were well and being tended to with care. But there were 3. Esther visited the cabin daily to check on Samuel. Her journal, small, stitched together with leftover thread, holds the few surviving contemporary descriptions of him. The child feeds well, reaches for light, laughs at the sound of my voice. He knows nothing of their fear. It is not his burden. Those pages, fragile and stained, remain the only honest account of Samuel's infancy. Rumors and the slow spread of knowledge. Within weeks, the enslaved community knew the story in full. They knew because stories of this nature always traveled quickly in such places. Whispered conversations slipped through doorways, across fields, behind the shelter of night. Some kept their knowledge silent, fearful of what would come. Others prepared quietly to protect Esther, who had taken on a role far more dangerous than midwife. The white families of neighboring plantations were slower to sense the shift, but not by much. They noticed that Margaret, the polite, composed mistress who once hosted afternoon teas and musical evenings, now avoided gatherings. Her sisters wrote letters that went unanswered. When a friend from Williamsburg finally visited unannounced, she was turned away at the door with the explanation that Margaret was unwell and resting. Yet the most telling detail was this: nobody had seen all the Fairmont infants together. The tension that followed Samuel grew rapidly, sturdy and alert. Esther noted that he seemed more inquisitive than most children she had tended. He stared at faces intently, grasped fingers with unusual strength, and calmed only when held close. But each milestone filled the household with more anxiety. His very existence was a ticking clock. Margaret flinched at stray sounds: a cry carried from the cabin, footsteps in the wrong corridor, a servant whispering too urgently. She began insisting that the nursery windows stay shuttered even in the heat. Servants overheard her pacing at night, muttering that someone must never see the children together, that the world would destroy her daughters if the truth surfaced. Thomas grew paranoid. Each time he rode into town, he scanned faces, as if afraid someone might suddenly announce what he had tried to hide. His temper grew short. On several occasions he accused servants of gossiping, though none had spoken within his hearing. The tension hardened the air of the house into something brittle. Even the walls seemed to listen. The Fairmont house survived the summer of 1802 by clinging to routine, but everyone inside it could feel the strain. Each day layered new tension over the last, until the simplest sounds carried unsettling weight: a door closing, a voice drifting from the yard, the faint cry of a child from the cabin where Samuel slept. To visitors, nothing appeared amiss. The Fairmonts were known for composure. Yet the veneer was thinning, and those who worked in the house sensed that something quiet and dangerous was gathering momentum. Margaret's withdrawals. Margaret's world shrank to a few rooms. Her daughters were kept near her at nearly all hours, except when the nursemaids insisted they needed fresh air. Even then, Margaret often followed, watching from behind a parlor window with an expression that suggested she feared the sky itself might expose her. Her unease was constant. She grew convinced the quarters whispered whenever she passed. When one of the girls fussed in the night, she paced the entire corridor until dawn, claiming she heard something outside: a rustle, a footstep, a murmur in the dark. Twice she summoned the overseer to search the grounds. Nothing was found, but she slept no better for it. Thomas's instability. Thomas, for his part, tried to bury himself in plantation business. He corrected ledgers that did not need correcting, rode twice daily along the fields, and spent long hours with the attorney responsible for Fairmont land holdings. But nothing stilled his temper. Even the smallest disruption provoked him. A servant dropping a basin, a door left ajar, a question Margaret repeated when she did not hear the answer. More than once, he rode into town simply to avoid the house, but Henrico County was small, and gossip smaller still. People observed the change. His old acquaintances noted that he drank more heavily and avoided conversations about domestic matters. A few sensed trouble, though they never guessed the truth. Esther's vigilance. Esther carried the true burden. She tended the twins in the nursery, answered to Margaret's rising demands, and slipped away when she could to the cabin where Samuel slept. She watched over him with a protective attention that the Fairmonts never understood. She saw the intelligence in his gaze, the way he studied movement and mimicry before most children learned to focus. She tracked his breathing, his growth, every small milestone. All of it went into her secret journal. S is rolling earlier than most, holds his head steady, follows voices. There is brightness in him. They would never allow themselves to see it. But Esther also sensed the danger building. The more Samuel thrived, the more difficult it became to keep him unseen. His cries occasionally carried farther than expected. A servant child nearly wandered into the cabin one afternoon. Margaret asked twice, too pointedly, whether the cabins had been quiet lately. Esther found herself constantly listening for signs that someone had learned the truth. The shifting rumors, the enslaved community had long known what the Fairmonts tried to hide, but the rumor began to take new shapes. Some said Margaret had gone mad. Others whispered that Thomas had cursed his own bloodline by denying his son. A few claimed the infant possessed uncanny resilience, as if protected by providence from the cruelty of the world into which he had been born. These whispers grew bolder as autumn approached. People spoke more openly around the night fires. Stories about the cabin multiplied. Esther heard them all, though she kept her expression even. She had no interest in feeding superstition. She simply wanted Samuel to survive. But rumors once born sharpen themselves. Margaret's fears turned to obsession. Margaret's fixation on silence deepened. She began sending servants to check the windows twice each hour. She forbade them from singing in the halls, claiming noise might attract attention. Once she ordered a rug removed because she believed its pattern resembled a face staring upward. Her nursemaids tried to soothe her. They offered tea, quiet conversation, scripture readings. Nothing helped. At night, she dreamt of footsteps in the courtyard. She told Thomas repeatedly that someone was watching the house, waiting for evidence of disgrace. Thomas attempted to reassure her at first, but with each new demand, each sleepless night, each tearful accusation, he grew cold. By early October, he avoided her entirely. He slept in his study or on the porch, waking stiff and irritable. His patience frayed until the slightest question from Margaret triggered an argument. The household learned to move carefully, as if walking across a floor that might splinter. Samuel's presence becomes a problem. Samuel was nearing 6 months old. His cries were stronger, his curiosity sharper. Esther sometimes caught him trying to pull himself upright. Far too early for most children. In another family, such early vigor would have been a delight. Here, it was a threat. More than once Margaret asked why she heard a child's voice from the yard. Esther deflected. She claimed it was one of the servant children, or a new arrival from another plantation. But Margaret was not convinced. She grew suspicious of anyone who lingered near the barn path. Twice she had the overseer question the mothers in the quarters about their infants. The truth sat just beyond her comprehension, which made her all the more frantic. The Hayes visit in November, the Hayes family from a neighboring plantation sent word requesting a visit for supper. Margaret refused, citing her health. Thomas tried to decline politely, but Mr. Hayes insisted. They wished to meet the new Fairmont children. They had already heard much, he said. That was exactly what Margaret feared. The night of the visit was tense. Margaret refused to bring the twins into the parlor at all. She claimed they were sleeping. The Hayes couple exchanged glances, but did not press the matter. They did, however, remark on how thin Margaret had become. While the Hayes carriage rolled away, Margaret watched from the window. She whispered to Thomas, "They know." He answered sharply, "They know nothing. You reveal more with your behavior than the truth ever could." That argument lasted deep into the night. Servants overheard fragments through the walls. Margaret accused him of endangering them all. Thomas accused her of losing her wits. At one point, something glass shattered. The house stayed awake until the noise stopped. The breaking point the next morning, the atmosphere had shifted. Margaret appeared pale, drained, almost hollow. Thomas rode away before sunrise without speaking to anyone. Esther found the twins fussing unattended, their blankets tangled, their cheeks streaked with tears. Margaret sat alone in the corner of the nursery, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. When Esther asked if she wished for breakfast, Margaret replied without looking up, "Someone is going to take them from me." Esther felt a coldness settle in her chest. It was clear now. The plantation could not continue in this suspended state. Margaret was unraveling. Thomas was becoming volatile. Samuel, growing, thriving, was the unspoken center of it all. Winter settled early over Fairmont Plantation in 1802. The cold brought a quiet that felt unnatural, as if the land itself were waiting for something to break. Frost crept along the windows of the big house each dawn, and the fireplaces burned from morning until night, yet no warmth reached the people who lived inside. Margaret moved through the halls like a shadow. She rarely spoke unless it concerned the twins, and even then her words were clipped and brittle. She suspected everyone. She watched everyone. She seemed to believe that if she blinked at the wrong moment, someone would glimpse the truth she had spent months burying. Thomas felt trapped by her spiraling fear. He had no patience left for soothing reassurance. Every attempt at conversation turned to accusation. He found himself avoiding her entirely, sometimes leaving the house before sunrise and returning after dark, hoping she would be asleep. But Margaret slept little. Her eyes were often bloodshot, her cheeks hollow. The weight of secrecy was wearing her down. The servants began to talk. People who worked in the house sensed that something unspoken had grown dangerous. The older servants walked more carefully than usual. Younger ones whispered in corners. The enslaved community had always known the truth of Samuel's birth, but with each passing week the story twisted and evolved. Some claimed the child had been born with a mark. Others said the mistress had struck the midwife when she saw him. A few believed Thomas had made a bargain to hide the child from God's sight. None of the rumors were true, but all of them carried a core understanding. A child had been hidden. Someone had paid a price for it. And the Fairmonts were coming undone. The weight of those murmurs pressed on Esther every day. She feared the wrong person would speak too loudly near the wrong ear. She feared Margaret would hear one whisper too many, and decide that silence must be enforced through harsher means. The twins grow while Samuel is kept in the corners. The Fairmont twins thrived under the endless care they received. Their cheeks grew rounder, their cries more purposeful. Their small hands grasped at toys, blankets, and fingers with the natural entitlement of children who would inherit wealth and status. Samuel, by contrast, lived quietly in Esther's cabin whenever he could be kept there. She fed him, rocked him, and watched over him with a devotion she never allowed the Fairmonts to see. He responded to her voice instantly. His eyes followed her with a clarity that unsettled her. He wasn't simply alert. He was keen. A child who noticed everything. A child who learned patterns and voices and footsteps faster than he should have. When he cooed or laughed, Esther felt joy and dread in equal measure. Joy because he was healthy, dread because healthy children are noticed. More than once, Margaret paused at a window when she heard a faint cry from the yard. "Whose child is that?" she would ask. "It isn't one of ours." Esther always had an explanation ready. Another woman's baby, a visitor to the quarters, a sound carried on the wind, but Margaret never truly believed her. Margaret's strength cracks. The deeper winter grew, the more unstable Margaret became. She worried that Samuel would somehow be discovered, even if she never laid eyes on him again. She imagined neighbors gossiping, imagined strangers looking at her with knowing expressions, imagined her daughters judged by something they had no part in. One night she told Thomas, "The walls know. I hear them whispering. Someone has been watching." The Thomas dismissed her fear, but his irritation only made her worse. The arguments returned, louder now, echoing down the halls for the servants to overhear. She accused him of being careless. He accused her of being unhinged. Their voices kept the entire house awake for hours. By morning, neither spoke at all. Esther confronts the growing risk. Esther understood that the situation was no longer sustainable. Margaret's mind was slipping. Thomas's patience was gone. Someone in the quarters was bound to say something that reached the main house. And Samuel, growing stronger by the day, could not remain invisible for much longer. Late one night, she wrote in her journal, "Secrets begin as small shadows. Then they stretch, reaching into every corner of a life until no light can pass through. The child is innocent, but innocence means nothing to those who fear truth." For she did not know whom she wrote for. Not herself, not Samuel, not the Fairmonts, but she felt compelled to record everything, every detail, every conversation, every wrong choice. She sensed history hanging over them like a storm. Thomas faces a problem he can't fix. By early 1803, Thomas found himself in a tightening circle. He could not acknowledge Samuel. He could not remove him. He could not explain him. He could not allow him to be discovered. Every option put his name and lineage at risk. He considered selling Samuel quietly, far away, but even that carried danger. Buyers asked questions. Word traveled between plantations. If the wrong person saw the child's face, the resemblance would speak for itself. The secret was becoming unmanageable, and Thomas was a man who believed any threat to his reputation had to be controlled. One way or another, the tension breaks. The breaking point came one snowy night when Margaret woke from a dream convinced someone had entered the nursery. The twins were safe, but she was certain she saw a figure moving outside the door. She sent a servant to check the halls. Nothing. She woke Thomas frantic. He dismissed her, frustrated. She followed him down the stairs, accusing him of ignoring danger. He snapped. The only danger in this house is the one you created. A glass shattered against the wall only seconds later. Servants heard everything. Some froze where they stood. Others quietly slipped away before the argument reached them. Esther, hearing the chaos from the nursery, held Samuel close. She could feel his small body trembling from the noise. She whispered to him, "Hush now. The world is loud, but you're safe with me." But even she doubted the words. What comes next? Thomas avoided the house for days after that fight. He stayed in the office near the stables, eating meals brought to him and refusing to answer questions. Margaret remained in her room, curtains drawn, speaking only through her nursemaid. The twins cried often, as if sensing the tension in the air. Samuel learned to crawl. Esther felt the timeline closing around them all. She saw the signs: Thomas's rising panic, Margaret's deepening paranoia, the servant's whispers, the infant who no longer stayed still. A decision was coming, one that would change everything. Spring arrived with an uneasy light at Fairmont Plantation in 1803. The air carried the scent of thawing earth, wet tobacco leaves, and the faint tang of smoke from the chimneys. But the season brought no relief. The tension that had settled over the house during winter had not lifted. It had only grown heavier, pressing down on everyone inside. Even the servants, who had long learned to read the subtle signals of their master's moods, felt a deeper sense of unease. Margaret rarely left her room. Her health, already fragile, deteriorated under the weight of her secret. She moved about silently, speaking only when addressed, and even then her answers were curt. She had grown gaunt, her fingers thin and pale, her eyes constantly scanning the corridors, as though expecting the walls themselves to betray her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against a shutter, seemed to announce the child's presence, though Samuel was safely hidden for now. Thomas noticed the change in her demeanor with irritation and apprehension. He avoided her as much as possible, retreating to his study or the stables. Work became his refuge, and yet even there, he found no peace. Business correspondences, plantation accounts, and negotiations with neighboring landowners were all tinged with anxiety. The hidden child was a shadow over every decision, a constant reminder that one misstep could undo decades of careful planning and social maneuvering. The growing risk. Samuel, meanwhile, was no longer a baby. He was 4 years old now, bright and curious, learning language quickly, recognizing faces, voices, and routines. Esther marveled at his intelligence, but each day brought more fear. The child's movements, his laughter, the sound of his voice. Each small joy was a potential exposure. She had to teach him the ways of invisibility, stay close to her in the presence of others, speak only when spoken to, always avoid drawing attention. Even so, the boy's natural vivacity made this difficult. He would wander, chasing a butterfly, examining a carved horse, or following a curious cat. Each excursion carried a risk of discovery. The servants noticed the tension too. Whispers persisted, rumors circulated, and the air in the quarters was thick with speculation. Some believed Margaret had taken a lover, others whispered that a child had been born who did not belong to Thomas. Esther knew the truth, but she also knew the danger of being too vocal. Samuel's survival depended on her silence. The breaking point approaches. By midsummer, the situation became unbearable. Margaret's anxiety reached a fever pitch. One afternoon, she burst into the study where Thomas was reviewing tobacco sales. "He is here," she exclaimed, her voice shaking. "I know it. I can feel it. That child is here watching us. waiting for the wrong moment to ruin everything. Thomas pinched the bridge of his nose. "Margaret, for God's sake, calm yourself. The child is under control."
"No, not controlled, not invisible. I hear him, Thomas. I see shadows.
She stopped abruptly, eyes wide as if she had glimpsed some terrible vision. Thomas remained silent, uncertain. He understood the stakes more clearly now than ever. Samuel's continued existence was no longer a private matter. It was a threat to their entire family. Yet even he could not bring himself to act as cruelly as Charlotte had once suggested. The child was his son, in some sense, and something in him recoiled at the thought of sending him into unknown hands with no assurance of care. Esther's role becomes crucial. Esther understood the unspoken calculus. Margaret's paranoia would only grow, Thomas's indecision would only worsen, and the longer Samuel remained, the higher the risk. She began preparing. Quietly, methodically, she gathered what supplies could help the boy survive an escape. If it became necessary, a small blanket, some bread, dried meat, and a carved toy horse to maintain the illusion of continuity. She spoke to Dinina whenever possible. The older woman, though frail, had survived decades of hardship and cruelty. Her wisdom was indispensable. Dinina advised on routes, timing, and methods to avoid discovery. She stressed caution above all else, but also reinforced a sense of urgency. The longer he stays, the higher the cost of delay, she warned. "You must be ready, Esther. You must think ahead." The decision is made. The tipping point came in early September. A traveling merchant arrived at the plantation with news from Richmond. Gossip had begun to seep beyond the immediate circle. Neighbors had begun speculating about a hidden child, and some even suggested Thomas had fathered a child with one of the women in the quarters. Thomas realized that any delay could be catastrophic. He could not acknowledge Samuel openly, but he also could not risk keeping him on the plantation. The practical solution, if one could call it that, was clear. Samuel had to be removed permanently, but in a way that preserved appearances. Charlotte's previous suggestion resurfaced in his mind. The missionary family traveling west offered a path. They would take children in need, orphaned or otherwise unwanted, to establish missions in the Ohio Valley. There, Samuel could be sent far from Virginia, beyond the reach of curious eyes, where he could survive and perhaps thrive. Thomas wrote to Charlotte immediately, requesting her assistance in arranging the transfer. Within weeks, correspondence confirmed that the Hayes family, Reverend Marcus Hayes, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 children, would arrive at Fairmont in early September to collect Samuel. The departure, the morning of the transfer, was somber. Margaret, pale and withdrawn, watched from a window as Esther prepared Samuel. Dinina remained in her cabin, too weak from illness and the lingering pain of punishment to accompany them. Samuel, unaware of the full implications, clutched his small blanket and looked up at Esther with trust-filled eyes. "You will be safe," Esther whispered, keeping her voice low. "You will learn, you will grow, and one day, you will understand." Samuel nodded, sensing the gravity even if he did not comprehend it fully. The wagon carrying the Hayes family and Samuel rolled slowly down the plantation road. Margaret's hand pressed to the glass, her eyes fixed on the disappearing figure of the boy she had never allowed herself to claim. Thomas, standing in the study, raised a glass of whiskey, but felt no warmth. The twins were nearby, unaware, playing quietly, oblivious to the life that had been removed to protect them. Esther remained calm externally, but internally she was shattered. She had done everything she could, but the system had won. The child was gone. Dinina's health would never fully recover. Margaret's mind would never heal from the secret she carried. And Thomas, he would continue his life in quiet torment, burdened by the knowledge of what he had allowed. The wagon carrying Samuel Hayes disappeared over the hills, leaving Fairmont Plantation behind like a wound that would never fully heal. The boy was gone, removed from the tangled web of secrets. Yet the ripples of his existence continued to touch every corner of the plantation. Life carried on outwardly unchanged, but beneath the surface, fractures widened, invisible yet undeniable. Margaret Fairmont retreated further into herself. Her grief was a hollow, gnawing thing, a mixture of relief and guilt. She had succeeded in erasing the evidence of her transgression, yet that success felt empty. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. She spent her hours in her chambers, rarely joining the family for meals, declining invitations to social events, and avoiding her son's gaze whenever possible. The twins, Thomas Jr. and Henry, noticed their mother's absence from their lives, but could not understand it. They only knew that the house was quieter, colder, and full of tension. Thomas, for his part, threw himself into the management of the plantation with renewed intensity. Tobacco yields, crop rotations, labor assignments. Everything became a measure of control in a world that had slipped beyond his grasp. Yet, no amount of work could quell the unease that clung to him. The social whispers, though distant, reached him in fragments. Merchants in Richmond, neighboring landowners, and even distant relatives began to speculate on the hidden child. Even without proof, rumors were poison. Thomas understood that his wealth and influence could not shield him from gossip forever. The plantation declines by 1810. Fairmont Plantation was no longer the thriving estate it had once been. Poor business decisions, compounded by Thomas's obsession with control and secrecy, drained resources. Portions of the land were sold to cover debts, and the enslaved population dwindled as families were broken apart and laborers sold off. The house itself became a symbol of faded grandeur, paint peeling, shutters sagging, and the grandeur of earlier days dimmed by neglect. Esther, meanwhile, continued her service quietly, ever mindful of the secret she carried. She had long since hidden her journal beneath a loose floorboard in her cabin, detailing every detail of Samuel's birth, his removal, and the suffering of those who had loved him. It was insurance against forgetfulness, a record of truth in a world designed to bury it. Though she remained outwardly compliant, her mind and heart were always elsewhere, living in the fragments of memory she had captured in writing. Dinina never recovered fully from the physical and emotional toll of Samuel's removal. Her body, weakened by age and punishment, declined steadily. She spoke less and less, her thoughts seemingly retreating to some private landscape where pain could not follow. Even so, she remained a sentinel of memory for the child she had loved as her own, and her silence spoke volumes to those who understood her sacrifice. The hidden child's shadow for Thomas Jr. and Henry, life moved forward in the structured, privileged world their father maintained. They sensed the tension in their parents, felt the unspoken grief and guilt, but were given no explanations. The absence of a sibling, the unnamed third child, lingered like a shadow over family gatherings, holidays, and everyday moments. Thomas Sr., despite outward appearances, continued to struggle with moral and emotional conflict. He had done what he deemed practical, yet every decision carried the weight of conscience. Samuel had been removed, yes, but at what cost? The family he sought to protect had fractured under secrecy, fear, and unacknowledged guilt. Thomas found no solace in wealth or status. Business ventures failed, debts accumulated, and the plantation steadily contracted under his mismanagement and obsession with control. By 1820, Fairmont was half its original size. Tobacco production continued, but with diminished labor and resources. The estate's reputation, once a source of pride, had eroded. Invitations to social events became infrequent, correspondences with influential figures grew terse, and Thomas sensed a subtle distancing in every interaction outside the plantation. The scandal, though unspoken, had cast a long shadow. The final years Margaret's health continued to decline. By 1827, she was a pale, fragile figure, weighed down by decades of guilt and isolation. The doctor diagnosed her with wasting sickness, though those who knew her understood it was more than illness. It was the slow surrender to despair. She died quietly in her chambers at age 42, leaving behind a household that had long since ceased to resemble a home. Thomas survived her by 7 years, dying in 1834 at age 62. His obituary, brief and formal, noted his service in the Virginia House of Burgesses and his management of Fairmont Plantation. It made no mention of scandal, secrets, or hidden children. The estate he left behind, diminished and burdened with debt, passed to Thomas Jr. and Henry. Neither son had the inclination, or perhaps the courage, to maintain the plantation. In 1836, they sold the land to a speculator who divided it into smaller farms. Esther, finally freed in 1823 through the provisions of Thomas's mother's will, moved to Richmond. At 47, worn by decades of service but alive, she carried her hidden journal with her. She found work as a seamstress and lived quietly, never revealing the story she knew in its entirety. Her life became a testament to resilience and quiet defiance, preserving the truth for the future. Dinina lived only 2 more years, her body succumbing to the years of toil, punishment, and heartbreak. Though she had survived the attempt to save Samuel, she never fully recovered the life she had lost. She passed away quietly, her suffering largely unnoticed outside the quarters, leaving behind only memories of her love and sacrifice. Rediscovery of the journal. It was not until 1889, decades after the events, that Esther's journal surfaced. Discovered in a trunk belonging to her great-granddaughter, its contents revealed the hidden story of Margaret Fairmont's 3rd child. The family, unsure how to handle the explosive information, consulted a lawyer and agreed to donate it to the Virginia Historical Society, stipulating it remain unpublished for 50 years. In 1952, a graduate student researching plantation life stumbled across the journal. Recognizing its significance, the student confirmed the existence of Samuel, the child erased from records, and the lengths to which his family and community had gone to protect appearances. Historians were left with fragments, tantalizing possibilities, and the tragic knowledge of lives destroyed by secrecy. Records from the Ohio mission where Samuel had been sent were incomplete. A tantalizing clue: a man named Samuel Hayes, age 48, listed as a schoolteacher in 1850, suggested he might have survived and built a life in Ohio. But nothing could be confirmed. Samuel's ultimate fate remained a mystery, a testament to the hidden histories of children erased to preserve wealth, reputation, and social order. The story of Samuel, Margaret Fairmont's hidden son, is not simply a tale of individual choices or familial scandal. It is a lens into a society built on brutal hierarchies, secrecy, and the commodification of human life. Plantation life, with its rigid rules of race and inheritance, forced impossible decisions. Children were erased, identities suppressed, and lives sacrificed for appearances. Samuel was one of many, though his story is unusually well documented. Plantations were environments of constant surveillance and moral compromise. White families obsessed over purity, while living intimately with enslaved people. Sexual exploitation was routine, and mixed-race children were considered threats to both property and reputation. Mothers like Margaret faced impossible choices: protect the children she could acknowledge or conceal those she could not. Fathers like Thomas were trapped between ownership, societal expectation, and an uneasy sense of responsibility. In this context, moral clarity rarely existed. The consequences of any choice were severe. Samuel's removal to Ohio, disguised as a charitable placement, highlights the ways in which society allowed the erasure of inconvenient lives. He was sent thousands of miles from the only people who had cared for him, hidden under the guise of religious benevolence. The frontier offered potential freedom, but also danger, disease, and uncertainty. Whether he survived and thrived or perished in anonymity, the decision belonged not to him, but to adults protecting themselves. His life, like so many others, became a collateral casualty in the pursuit of social propriety. The ripple effects of this secrecy were profound. Margaret lived in isolation, consumed by guilt. Thomas, haunted by the child he could not openly claim, pursued wealth and control in a futile attempt to compensate for personal failings. Dinina, who loved Samuel as her own, endured physical punishment and psychological devastation. Esther, bearing the truth in secret, dedicated herself to recording the story, ensuring that memory survived even if justice could not. Every adult touched by Samuel's existence carried the weight of decisions imposed by an unjust system. The historical record, as often is the case, obscures more than it reveals. For decades, the Fairmont Plantation's official history presented only the achievements and tragedies deemed socially acceptable. Triplets were acknowledged only insofar as they conformed to inheritance laws. One child vanished from every ledger, every photograph, every account. It was as if Samuel had never existed, and yet, he did. His story, rediscovered centuries later through Esther's journal, reminds us that history is always incomplete, shaped by the perspectives and prejudices of those who record it. Historians can speculate about Samuel Hayes in Ohio, piecing together fragments from censuses, church records, and missionary accounts. But speculation cannot restore what was lost: the first years of his life, the bond with Dinina, the nurturing he might have received from Margaret, if societal constraints had permitted it. The absence of these years is a testament to the human cost of secrecy and fear. Each erased child represents a life denied context, love, and identity. This story also forces reflection on the countless unknown children whose fates were never documented. How many Samuels were there across Virginia, the Carolinas, and the American South? How many families were fractured, lives destroyed, opportunities denied, all in service of protecting wealth, social standing, or reputations? The patterns evident in Fairmont are not anomalies, but reflections of the broader system. Slavery was not only a system of forced labor, it was a system of moral corruption, coercion, and erasure. For those who survived the system, Dinina, Esther, and others like them, life was a series of compromises, each choice constrained by risk, power, and fear. Dinina's final years withdrawn and broken, and Esther's meticulous record-keeping, demonstrate how survival often came at the expense of the heart. The stories they preserved, and the sacrifices they endured, are the only testaments to the human lives that existed within this machinery of oppression. In the end, Samuel's story is both singular and emblematic. It is singular in its details: a triplet hidden, a conspiracy to conceal a child, a journey westward under the guise of missionary care. It is emblematic of a wider pattern of human exploitation and moral compromise. The stakes of secrecy, the power of social expectation, and the vulnerability of children in such a system were not unique to Fairmont. They were the reality across the antebellum South. The legacy of Samuel's story endures not in the physical records of Fairmont or the Ohio mission, but in the questions it raises. Who decides which lives matter? How do fear and reputation shape morality? What becomes of those lost to secrecy, and who carries their memory? Even as the plantation decayed, and its buildings were repurposed into a museum, the untold story of the hidden triplet lingered, an invisible scar on the landscape of history. Historians and descendants, armed with journals, censuses, and fragments of letters, can piece together a partial narrative, but the full truth, the full human experience, remains beyond reach. Samuel may have survived, grown, and contributed quietly to the world, or he may have perished, his potential unfulfilled, another casualty of a system that treated children as problems to be managed rather than lives to be nurtured. The most haunting aspect is not merely the disappearance of one child, but the systemic nature of these disappearances. For every Samuel documented, countless others vanished without record. The past, deliberately erased, becomes a silent witness to the violence of social expectation, the cruelty of unacknowledged truths, and the human cost of a society built on exploitation. History, in the end, is a series of fragments. Samuel's story reminds us that beneath the veneer of plantation grandeur, beneath the laws, ledgers, and letters, lay lives constrained, erased, and manipulated. His life was both hidden and consequential. Though he may never appear in official accounts, the echo of his existence challenges the narrative of the past, demanding recognition for those who were silenced, forgotten, or discarded. Samuel's story is a call to examine the hidden histories of all societies, those erased for convenience, status, or fear. It forces reflection on morality, power, and the fragile nature of memory. The truths of human experience, however inconvenient, endure, waiting for the moment when someone dares to listen, record, and remember. And so, in the quiet spaces of Fairmont Plantation, in the pages of Esther's long, hidden journal, and in the possibility that Samuel lived beyond the records, the hidden child remains, not as a scandal, not as an inconvenience, but as a life whose existence, though obscured, demands acknowledgement. History may forget details, may suppress stories, may rewrite events, but some truths persist, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The disappearance of Samuel and the secrecy surrounding his life left an indelible mark on everyone connected to him. Margaret Fairmont's guilt and isolation, Thomas's obsessive management of the plantation, and Dinina's broken spirit were all consequences of choices made under the weight of societal expectations. The decisions that seemed pragmatic at the time caused long-lasting emotional and psychological scars. Esther's journal became the silent witness to these events, a record of the truth that no one else could acknowledge. It captured not only Samuel's story, but the lives of those who loved and protected him. In documenting his existence, Esther preserved a moral memory that history itself had sought to erase. Her meticulous entries demonstrate how personal acts of remembrance can defy erasure and challenge the narratives constructed by those in power. The ripple effects of Samuel's removal were felt for decades. The Fairmont family's wealth diminished, their influence faded, and the plantation itself deteriorated. The children raised without knowledge of the hidden triplet grew up in a house haunted by unspoken truths. Social connections weakened, alliances faltered, and the veneer of perfection that the family fought to maintain crumbled slowly. The absence of one child revealed the fragility of the system they tried to uphold. Samuel's fate in Ohio remained uncertain. Records hint at a man named Samuel Hayes, a schoolteacher, living a quiet life in a small frontier town. Whether this was the same Samuel or another child entirely remains unconfirmed. The possibility that he survived, thrived, and built a life far removed from the horrors of Fairmont Plantation offers a fragile hope. A reminder that even in erasure, life can endure and identity can be reclaimed. This story raises larger questions about the lives lost to secrecy. How many children were hidden, sold, or sent away under the guise of propriety? How many mothers endured silent suffering, and how many caretakers like Dinina sacrificed everything to protect a child? Each hidden life represents the human cost of social and racial hierarchies, a testament to the suffering inflicted by a system designed to protect wealth and reputation above humanity. The legacy of Samuel's story is not confined to the Fairmont Plantation or the Hayes family. It reverberates through history as a reminder of the moral compromises demanded by oppressive structures. It shows how fear and social expectation can dictate life or death, opportunity or erasure. It demonstrates the importance of preserving hidden histories, of listening to the stories that were silenced, and of acknowledging the human consequences behind historical records. Today, the Fairmont Plantation stands as a museum, its architecture and tobacco fields preserved for public education. Visitors may admire the grandeur, learn about plantation operations, and hear of its role in colonial Virginia, yet the hidden narratives, the erased children, the conspiracies, the suffering of those enslaved, often remain obscured. Esther's journal, rediscovered in the late 19th century, provides a rare glimpse into these concealed truths, challenging us to consider what has been omitted from official histories. Samuel's life, whether fully realized or tragically cut short, is a reminder that history is more than names, dates, and events. It is the sum of lived experiences, of moral choices, of suppressed truths, and of acts of courage. The stories of children like Samuel, caretakers like Dinina, and witnesses like Esther endure because someone dared to remember, to record, and to preserve what society wished to erase. The story of Margaret Fairmont's hidden child is emblematic of countless untold histories. It illuminates the human cost of secrecy, the intersection of morality and survival, and the resilience of memory against the tide of erasure. In remembering Samuel, we confront the uncomfortable truths of the past, acknowledging the lives lost and the choices forced upon those trapped by systems of oppression. Ultimately, Samuel's story is not just about one child, it is about the countless lives obscured by fear, prejudice, and power. It challenges us to reflect on the histories we inherit, the truths we overlook, and the importance of bearing witness to those whose existence was almost forgotten. History may conceal, but memory endures, and in remembering, we honor lives that were nearly erased, even after Samuel's removal and the apparent resolution of the scandal. The consequences of the Fairmont family's decisions continued to unfold. The emotional toll on Margaret Thomas and Dinina never fully dissipated. Margaret's guilt and grief left her a shadow of herself, retreating from social life and ultimately succumbing to despair. Thomas's attempts to maintain control over the plantation could not restore the family's former prosperity or heal the fractures caused by secrecy and fear. The very measures taken to protect the family's reputation had sown long-term instability and emotional ruin. Esther, now freed and living in Richmond, carried with her the weight of memory. Her journal became a private testament to injustice and compassion, a record of what the Fairmont family attempted to erase. It served as a warning. History, when left unrecorded, allows cruelty and secrecy to persist unchallenged. Through her meticulous notes, Esther preserved Samuel's existence and the sacrifices of those who sought to protect him, ensuring that at least some part of the truth survived beyond the lifetimes of those who had caused or endured harm. Samuel's fate in Ohio, while hinted at in fragmented records, remains largely a mystery. The man named Samuel Hayes in the 1850 census, potentially the child of Fairmont Plantation, represents both hope and uncertainty. Did he survive the frontier, build a life free from the shadow of his birth, and achieve a measure of independence? Or did the harsh realities of pioneer life claim him, leaving only traces in obscure records and oral histories? The lack of definitive evidence reflects the broader pattern of erased lives. How easily children, particularly those born into circumstances of exploitation, could vanish from history. The story of Samuel also forces reflection on the systemic structures of the time. Plantations relied not only on forced labor, but also on the careful management of appearances, reputation, and inheritance. Children of mixed race were threats to the social order, often hidden, sold, or rebranded to fit the narratives of white families. The Fairmont case, while extreme in its secrecy and the involvement of multiple conspirators, was emblematic of a broader pattern across the South. Each concealed child represents lives disrupted, parents burdened with moral compromise, and the human cost of maintaining social hierarchy. Margaret Fairmont's story, and by extension Samuel's, challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and morality. It demonstrates how fear of scandal can dictate decisions that affect multiple generations, shaping lives in profound and lasting ways. Dinina's courage, Esther's perseverance, and the unknown resilience of Samuel reveal acts of resistance, compassion, and remembrance that defy oppression and secrecy. Even centuries later, the questions linger. How many other children like Samuel were hidden, forgotten, or erased to maintain appearances? How many caretakers like Dinina risked their lives and bodies to protect those vulnerable to systemic cruelty? How often did silence become the chosen form of justice or survival? The legacy of this story is both a cautionary tale and a reminder. History is not solely composed of grand events and prominent figures. It is also shaped by those whose lives were nearly erased, whose experiences were ignored, and whose existence was treated as inconvenient. The truths preserved in journals, letters, and oral histories offer us glimpses into these hidden worlds, challenging us to see the past with honesty and empathy. Samuel's story reminds us that memory and documentation can resist erasure, even when the powerful attempt to conceal the truth. And it reminds us, too, that understanding the human cost of history requires looking beyond surface narratives, listening to those who endured, and honoring the lives that were nearly forgotten. By the mid-19th century, the Fairmont Plantation had changed hands multiple times, its fields diminished, its halls quieter, and its once prominent family largely faded from local memory. Yet the shadows of its past lingered in subtle ways. The stories of hidden children, silenced servants, and quiet acts of resistance persisted in fragments, tales whispered among neighbors, recalled by aging workers, or embedded in old journals like Esther's. Esther's writings, preserved in secret, offered a rare window into the human cost of the plantation's obsession with appearances. She chronicled Samuel's birth, Dinina's bravery, and the convoluted moral compromises of the Fairmonts. Her notes reminded later generations that history is not solely composed of the deeds of the wealthy and powerful, but also of those who acted quietly, courageously, or in desperate defiance. The journal became more than a record. It was a testament to survival, memory, and moral reckoning. Yet Samuel's personal fate remained elusive. Historians could only speculate about the man listed as Samuel Hayes in Ohio. Did he carry the weight of his hidden origins into adulthood, or did frontier life erase the past entirely? Did he achieve the independence and dignity denied him as a child, or did the legacy of being the hidden one shadow his existence? Every unanswered question underscores the fragility of historical memory and the countless lives erased by circumstance, fear, or deliberate concealment. The moral complexity of the Fairmont story continues to resonate. Margaret's actions, while shaped by fear and societal pressure, resulted in profound harm. Thomas's decisions, motivated by property and reputation, compounded the suffering. Yet acts of love and courage also emerged. Dinina's selflessness, Esther's dedication to recording truth, and the missionary's willingness to provide a new life for Samuel. Within cruelty and secrecy, traces of humanity persisted. The story also invites reflection on broader patterns. Across plantations and households, children like Samuel were frequently hidden, sold, or erased. Each life carried potential, hope, and vulnerability. Yet the social structures of the time prioritized reputation and inheritance over individual well-being. The Fairmont story, extreme though it was, likely mirrored countless untold experiences of children who vanished quietly, leaving only hints of existence in oral traditions or sparse records. Ultimately, the tale of Samuel Fairmont, or Samuel Hayes, as he may have become, is a reminder that history is layered, complicated, and often incomplete. Some stories are deliberately obscured, others fade naturally. What survives are fragments, whispers, and traces, demanding careful attention, empathy, and imagination to reconstruct the lives that were lived in silence. In the end, the haunting lesson is clear: the past is never truly gone. The secrets of Henrico County, the lives hidden in plain sight, and the consequences of fear and secrecy ripple across generations. While the Fairmont name persists in local lore and museum plaques, the deeper truths of lost children, silenced witnesses, and moral compromises linger in the shadows, waiting for recognition, understanding, and remembrance. Time passed, yet the echoes of Fairmont Plantation never fully faded. The land changed hands, the fields grew wild, and the plantation house, now a museum, bore silent witness to decades of memory and omission. Visitors marveled at its architecture and grounds, unaware of the human dramas hidden behind closed doors. They could never know the lives erased or displaced, the children who were considered problems to be solved, rather than lives to be valued. Samuel's story remained a fragment of history, pieced together from Esther's journal and sparse references. Whether he survived, thrived, or suffered in Ohio, he had been given a chance denied to countless others. His very existence, hidden, then removed, exemplified the harsh realities of a society where fear, reputation, and property dictated human lives. He symbolized the children whose names were never recorded, whose faces never appeared in portraits, whose voices were lost to silence. For Margaret and Thomas, the consequences of their choices lingered quietly. Margaret's guilt consumed her final years, her grief for a child she never embraced shadowing her every thought. Thomas, though outwardly successful in business and society, faced a diminished legacy and the knowledge that some parts of his life could never be reconciled. The family's social standing, once so carefully protected, had been irreversibly compromised, not by public scandal alone, but by the internal fractures of fear, secrecy, and moral compromise. Yet even in this darkness, small acts of courage and humanity endured. Dinina's defiance, Esther's careful documentation, and the missionary family's willingness to offer a new life to Samuel reminded us that resistance, compassion, and moral conviction can exist even in oppressive systems. These acts, though quiet and often unseen, shaped the world in ways that escaped the record books. Ultimately, the story of Samuel Fairmont is a lens through which we glimpse the broader truths of the past, that history is often written in omissions, that the lives of the vulnerable can be erased, and that secrecy and fear can carry consequences across generations. It reminds us to listen closely, to question what is left unsaid, and to seek out the stories buried beneath the official accounts. The final lesson of Fairmont Plantation is both haunting and human. The past is full of choices, some cruel, some compassionate, all consequential. And while we may never know the full fate of Samuel, the hidden child, we can honor the lives lost and remember the stories that were almost erased. In doing so, we bear witness not only to history, but to the enduring resilience of those who dared to care, to act, and to survive.